Dyer Productions present The Story Slot, traditional stories and fairy tales adapted by Grandle. The story in this episode is The Three Sillies from English Fairy Tales collected by Joseph Jacobs.
Once upon a time, there was a farmer and his wife, who had one daughter, Mavis. When she grew to be a young woman, she met a young gentleman named Percy, and they began courting. Every evening he would come and see her, and eat supper with the family at the farmhouse. Mavis would go down to the cellar to draw the beer for supper. One evening she went down to draw the beer, and she happened to look up at the ceiling while she was drawing, and she suddenly saw a mallet stuck in one of the beams. It must have been there a long, long time, but somehow or other she had never noticed it before, and she began thinking. She realised that it must be very dangerous for that mallet to be there.
Oh dear, what if dear Percy and I were married and had a son, and we sent him down here to draw the beer when he got old enough, and the mallet fell on his head? It might kill him. Oh, wouldn't it be dreadful?
Mavis put down the jug and the candle she had brought to light her way, and began crying at the thought of it. Upstairs they were all beginning to think she was taking rather a long time, so Mrs. Farmer went down to the cellar to see what was the matter. She was very surprised to see Mavis crying and the beer running all over the floor. "Why, whatever is the matter?"
Oh, Mother, look at that horrid mallet. What if Percy and I were married and had a son, and we sent him down here to draw the beer when he got old enough, and the mallet fell on his head? It might kill him.
"Oh, wouldn't that be dreadful?" And Mrs. Farmer sat down beside Mavis and began crying as well. After a little while, Mr. Farmer began to worry and decided to come down and see what was wrong. But he hadn't reckoned on finding his wife and daughter sat crying together, with his best beer running all over the floor.
"Whatever is it, Mrs. Farmer? What's the matter, Mavis?"
"Just look up there at that horrid mallet. What if Percy and Mavis were married and had a son, and we sent him down here to draw the beer when he got old enough, and the mallet fell on his head? It might kill him."
Wouldn't it be dreadful?
Mr. Farmer sat down beside his wife and daughter and began crying too. By this time, Percy was wondering what on earth could be going on down in the cellar, and came down to find out. Well, he was most dismayed to find them all crying, with the beer running all over the floor. He first ran to the tap and turned it off.
"Whatever are you three up to down here? Sat there crying to yourselves and letting the beer run out?"
"Just look at that horrid mallet, Percy. What if you and Mavis were married and had a son, and we sent him down here to draw the beer when he was old enough, and the mallet fell on his head? It might kill him."
Mr. and Mrs. Farmer and Mavis all started crying even louder and heartier than before. But young Percy burst out laughing, and reaching up, he took down the mallet.
"I've travelled many, many miles, and seen many things, but I've never met such big sillies as you three before. I shall start on my way travelling again, and when I find 3 bigger sillies than you, I shall come back and marry Mavis."
He wished them goodbye and set off on his way, leaving Mr. and Mrs. Farmer and Mavis all crying heartily. But now they were crying because Mavis had lost her sweetheart. So Percy set out and travelled a long, long way. At last he came to a cottage. There was some grass growing on the roof, and the lady who lived there was trying to coax her cow up a ladder. The cow did not seem to want to go up to the roof. "Look, Bessie, all that beautiful grass. Don't you want to go up and eat it?"
"What are you doing?"
"I want her to go up and eat the grass. She doesn't realise that she'll be quite safe. I shall tie a string round her neck and pass it down the chimney and keep it tied to my wrist as I go about the house, so she can't fall off without my knowing about it."
"Oh, you poor silly. You ought to cut the grass yourself and throw it down for the cow."
"Oh, it's much easier to get Bessie up there than to get the grass down." So she pushed and coaxed until at last Bessie went up the ladder. Then the lady tied a string round her neck, passed it down the chimney, and fastened it to her own wrist. Percy hadn't gone far on his way when the cow tumbled off the roof and hung there by the string around her neck. Poor old Bessie! And the weight of her pulled the lady on the other end of the string. She was pulled right into the chimney and got stuck there.
Well, that was one big silly.
Percy went along on his way again, walking and walking until he found an inn where he could stop for the night. But the inn was very full up, so he had to share his room with another traveller. But Percy didn't mind that, as the other man seemed a very pleasant fellow. When they got up in the morning, Percy was very surprised to see the way the other man tried to put on his trousers. He hung his trousers on the knobs of the chest of drawers, ran across the room, and tried to jump into them. He tried it over and over again, but he just couldn't manage it. Percy wondered whatever he was doing it for. At last the traveller stopped, wiping his face with his handkerchief.
Oh dear, are trousers just the most awkward kind of clothes? I can't think who could have invented such a thing. It sometimes takes me an hour to get into mine in the morning, and I get so hot and bothered. How do you manage yours?
Percy burst out laughing, and showed him how to put them on properly.
Well, I'm very much obliged to you. I should never have thought of doing it that way.
So that was another big silly. Percy went on his travels again. Soon he came to a village. Just outside the village there was a pond. Around the pond was a crowd of people. They all had rakes, brooms and pitchforks, using them to reach into the pond.
What's the matter?
Percy asked one of the people.
What's going on?
Why, the moon's fallen into the pond. We can't rake it out.
Well, Percy burst out laughing at this.
Look up into the sky. There's the moon. It's only the reflection in the water.
But they wouldn't listen and got quite cross with him. So Percy hurried away as quickly as he could. So there were a whole lot of sillies much bigger than Mavis and her parents. Percy turned towards home to keep his promise and marry Mavis. And if they didn't live happily ever after, that's nothing to do with you and me.
You've just heard the story of the Three Sillies. Mavis was played by Layla Katib, Mrs. Farmer and Cow Lady by Jane Grandle, Mr. Farmer by Pete Lutz, Percy by J.D. Kelly, The Traveller by Russell Gold, with additional voices by Jamie Dyer. The narrator was Jane Grandle, who also adapted the story. The story slot was brought to you by J. Dyer Productions.